everybody, this is Anne and welcome back to Painting Big. So ReaperCon is next week and I am really crunched. So I have a really short video for you today. Let's talk about how to keep the paint inside paint pots fresh and good for longer. All right, let's get to it. So there's a few companies still doing paint pots. Probably the most famous, of course, is, our friend here, Citadel. I personally got into this because I have these old bottles. Remember these? Those of you who've been around for a long time? I have like 4 bottles of mithril silver from back in the day because this is my favorite silver metallic. And when it went out of print, when they replaced it with the next iteration of their line, I pretty much grabbed as many bottles of this as I could. So I've been keeping these bottles good for a very long time. First, let's talk a little bit about why the paint in paint pots tends to dry out or go bad a little faster. And part of that is compared to something like a dropper bottle paint, you only have like one lid. So, you've got one lid. Whereas when you open a dropper bottle paint, you have 2. You've got the nipple here and you've got the cap, right? And this means that there's an extra layer, almost like a double-walled container. But there's essentially an extra layer to get through when it comes to air leaching into the bottle. So the double cap actually gives dropper bottle paints a little protection as far as staying good for longer. Now, you can get around this with your paint pot paints, and the way to do it is to store them upside down. This is point number 1 on how to keep your paint pot paints good for longer. Sadly, they have a flat top on this, which makes it very easy. These are rounded tops, and they do not store upside down nearly as easily, so you'd have to pack them in or, there we go. I can kind of balance it. You could probably make it work. The reason you want to do this is that when you store the paint upside down, these seals, where the air can get in, are kind of buried under the liquid here, and that helps keep air from just leaching into the bottle and out through these easy apertures. The other reason these dry out a little faster, by the way, is that you have 2 ways for the air to get in, not just the top, but also this second seal around here where the top is actually screwed onto the bottle. So that essentially gives you 2 places that fresh air can leach in and help the paint to dry out. You solve that when you bury that under the fluid of the paint, and essentially helps to seal these and keep air from leaching in to help dry out the paint. So, okay, the second thing that I always do, and actually this one is just about ready for it. Look how goopy that is. See how goopy that is? Yeah. So this one is more than ready for it, and this is adding a little bit of water to my paint. Now, if your paint has a recommended thinner that isn't water, I would probably use that. But even in paints where it's not recommended you thin with water, 1 or 2 drops is really not going to hurt. You can see how thick this has gotten. Now this is about halfway full, I think. I'm going to put 10 drops. 10 drops. I keep a dropper bottle around because I'm always using a well palette, so I'm using this to add water to my paints in particular ratios. There's a little bit of flow improver in here. I'm going to shake it up really well. If you ever want agitators in your bottles and you want safe agitators, something like a volcanic glass or hematite bead is probably the cheapest and safest option. They're not quite as heavy as something like a ball bearing, but they're not going to ever rust out on you. They're totally inert. So just as an aside for you. So now you can see not nearly, see that little thread of paint, still a little goopy, but not nearly as bad. The paint looks a lot more fluid. If I really want this one to stay good for a while, I could even go a little bit further. 3, 4, 5. Essentially, you've got so many drops of paints inside these bottles that adding like 5 or 10 drops really isn't going to thin your paint appreciably. It certainly won't break the paint. I'm about to do it to this fresh bottle of Screamer Pink just to demonstrate what kind of consistency I get. Hold on, let me grab. There we go. All right. Shaking that up. That's good. So now I can see the paint is moving. It's fluid. It's good. Excellent. So, okay, we're going to come back to this in a second when I talk about the final factor in keeping your pot paints good. But first, let's just demonstrate. This is a really fresh bottle. You can see even some separation. I'm going to see. Let's see. I need a model to demo on. Sure, let's make this Orc's Fur pink. Why not? There's nothing, you have nothing against pink orcs, I'm sure, everybody. Okay, so let's just use this straight out of the bottle. Screamer pink. And pretty much what I want to do here is I want to test and see if thinning this paint is going to make any difference. If I add a little bit of water to it, is it going to make any difference in the coverage or the way it acts? I always, I like to test these things. And I know the point of, like, Games Workshop paint. Yeah, that's a nice color. And this is one of their base colors, by the way. So it is a little bit on the thick side so that it can have better coverage. Otherwise, a color like this would be pretty dicey for coverage because it's like probably got a lot of magenta pigment in it, and magenta is a very, very transparent pigment. All right, so now I'm going to actually add 10 drops. 10 drops, and this is actually a full bottle of paint, but we'll see how it acts. Games Workshop paints are not meant to be necessarily, you know, thinned a lot if they're base coat paints, but obviously they're like, you can use this straight out of the bottle. It's kind of their shtick. All right, let's see. How does it look? Oh yeah, there we go. Nice fluid. Looks great, actually. Looks really nice. So I'm doing this just to demonstrate that adding like 10 drops of water into your, oh yeah, it's fine. Adding 10 drops of water into your Games Workshop paint, or, you know, any other really paint pot paint, isn't going to break the paint. But it does give you that much more water that has to evaporate out of your paint before it starts drying out. So essentially you're giving your paint, you're not affecting, like I'm getting the exact same coverage, no problem here between one and the other on this Zenith Prime. I'll get closer to proof that here, hold on. Now obviously one of these is a little bit more dry and the other is more wet. So you can see the drying, it's dulling the color a little bit, and that's just something that happens naturally as a paint dries, especially if it's got a matte finish to it. It will look a little more dull when it is dry than when it is wet. But you can see that it looks exactly the same. So adding a little bit of water to your pots of paint is going to keep the paint a little more fluid. One, it's going to come off your brush a little easier. If you do what I did and use like a flow improver, you can also help breaking surface tension, so the paint will come off your brush easier when you're putting it on your model, and you'll keep it from evaporating as quickly. I would say with these paint pots, I tend to, I thin them when I remember, and usually that's about like once a year to 2 years, so it's not like you have to like be really, really on it. If the paint's, especially if you're storing it right, I do try to store these correctly, so that will of course also slow down the evaporation process. So yeah, you don't have to be like on this like all the time. It's just something that'll help you out. And before you ask if you're trying to do this with your contrast paints, I would definitely use the contrast medium to further thin these guys. Yes, they're going to evaporate like any paint product, but the fact that they're so very fluid means they have a lot of evaporating they need to do before you're in trouble. If you do see them getting a little thick, or you notice that the color doesn't work as well as a contrast paint, then definitely use that contrast paint medium and just thin it down a little bit more. And you shouldn't have to worry about really your washes. All right, so the last way to help keep your pot paints good and keep them in top form is you have to watch this kind of thing. So what happens with pots, and it happens in these too, you can see that little rim there. See where the paint's up here? When that paint gets up on this upper edge, that's going to start to dry out, especially if you keep your paint pots open, right? So every once in a while, it might be a good idea to take a tissue and just clean off that upper edge. Because what happens there is that the paint up there will dry, and if it is on the top edge or near it, it may get pushed back into the bottle when you move your lid down and press it. And what happens then is that that dried paint becomes tiny flakes of dried paint, and that gets into your paint. And then even if you've got a perfectly good bottle of paint as far as its fluid consistency, you'll notice that it's grainy when you're brushing it on. It takes a while to really, really corrupt a paint that way, but I mean, even a little bit of like paint specks and lumps, I mean, nobody wants to paint with lumpy paint. Let's just be honest with each other. So doing that little bit, just when you're using the paint, like wiping off that top rim. This guy's very goopy because I let it get so far along before I thinned it. So I've got to get myself in there and get that. Oh, I should just pull this out. There we go. And I just want to get enough. You can see that it's more stringy than it is gritty, but you don't want that latexing stuff to get into your paint either. So just try to clean it off. As much as you can. Yeah, mostly just all around the actual mouth of the paint. And we've got some potential trouble spots up here too. I can see though that that's actually a big skin of paint, so hold on. We can fix this. I'm actually going to use a sculpting tool because I've got one here. So I think this is just, yep, look at that. That's dried paint. So when you see something like this, just kind of take it off before it becomes an issue. There we go. Much better. Much better. So much less chance now that any of that's going to turn into grit or particles that's going to get into my paint. Safe for another year or two. Yes! All right, everybody, I hope that this was informative, much as it was short. There are so many companies doing dropper bottles now that I think some of the old school esoteric lore about how to keep pop paints good has like gone by the wayside. So I wanted to do this video, especially for those of you who are just getting in. I know a lot of people do get in via Games Workshop paints or other pop paints, so I wanted to talk about it. And before you ask, yeah, you can use this. The thinning trick is something you can do and should do to your dropper bottles as well. They just won't need it as often. So any paint in a dropper bottle, I usually tell people, you know, add like 10 drops every few years. Shake it really well. It's actually just as important to shake your paints with some frequency as it is to add extra fluid, because the longer your paints sit in one space, the more the actual like components of the paint have a chance to settle out. And if you let an acrylic paint settle out for years and years without it moving, it has a chance to just turn into a plastic plug. And some of you who've been in the hobby for a long time actually have had this happen to paints. So add water to your paint. When you do, shake it really well. Make sure to take any excess paint that might dry and drop grit into your bottle off with a tissue or a paper towel before you recap it. And when you can, store it upside down so that that fluid creates a nice seal to keep more air from flooding into the bottle and evaporating the paint. All right, thanks so much for watching, everybody. I'll be back at you soon, and this is Anne signing off.